Thank you, Carmen. Good morning, everybody. We're getting ready to go here. My name is Alison, and this is the Sunday morning service of the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Potsdam. I am a member of the congregation and will be leading the service today. We are a congregation that welcomes all. Whether you're seeing us with spirits high or spirits low, we welcome you. Whether your beliefs tend toward atheism or theism, liberalism or conservatism, we welcome you. So whoever you are, wherever you are, whomever you love, we are glad you are with us today. Unitarian Universalism is built on 7 ethical principles. They are written on the side of your order of service. In addition to our principles, our UU culture promotes the notion that wisdom can be found from many sources, with a special place held by reason and science, but can also be found in the arts, humanities, and in spiritual intuition. We believe we have much to learn from the great thinkers of the past, but in building the future, we are not permanently tied to any past ideology or theology. With these values in mind, we consider a wide array of topics at our various Sunday morning services, and we have a wide array of speakers, including our ministers, guest ministers, members of our congregation, lay speakers from outside our fellowship. Okay, we're ready for announcements. I will begin with an announcement from the board. The board has decided that we will no longer require people to wear masks in our building. This decision was informed by a CDC created risk framework where only counties that were rated at high risk were advised to mask indoors. In other counties, the choice to mask was taken to be up to the individual. The counties that in our region are rated at low risk. In addition, we ask people with symptoms, a positive test, or exposure to someone with COVID to join the service on Zoom. So this is a change. We continue to monitor the epidemic and monitor all advice given by the CDC, and hopefully this will stand for a while, but if things change, we will have to change back to requiring masking. Any other announcements? Trish, do you have an announcement?
Yes, I have an announcement. I'm sorry I'm not able to be with you today, but the fact is we are moving ahead on our climate justice initiative. And we have a plan to be at the Reading Earth Day celebration from noon till 6 p.m. on April 23rd. And Kay Price is taking the lead on that. We are hoping to have a banner to adorn the table that we will be using. And if someone has design skills, we would really appreciate you being in contact with either Kay or I and Kimberly Culp, who has been forward in saying that she would be working on our social media sites. So the other thing that anybody is welcome to go to that table that day. It will be a lot of fun. There are a lot of kid-friendly things going on, and you can make a lot of contacts with other groups doing the same work. So it would be a fun day out, and it would be useful for our congregation, building it and spreading the word. The other thing is we are having a movie night on April 9th at 5 p.m. It's a Saturday evening, and it's a climate-related movie. And we would love to have you come and then have a short discussion afterwards. It's a popular movie called Don't Look Up. You may have heard about it. It's a Netflix special. And apparently it's quite funny until it all of a sudden it isn't funny anymore. And that's sort of where we are with climate change. So I urge you to come. It'll be a lot of fun. We can build our community this way. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other announcements? Okay, we come to lighting the chalice. We don't have many rituals in Unitarian Universalism. One of them is lighting the chalice. It's the event that marks the beginning of the main part of our service, where we change the focus of our minds from our everyday activity, from our to-do list, to a more relaxed, contemplative state. Next, we come to the offering. Our fellowship has existed for over 50 years because over those years, our members and friends have generously contributed the knowledge and labor needed to build and maintain our physical structure, the vision and imagination and creativity to create our programs, compassion and love for each other to make us feel at home, and the hospitality that welcomes new people into our community. That is a lot. But at this time in the service, we ask for one more ingredient that is necessary to keep this good thing going: additional financial support. Thank everybody for their contribution. Our earth began as a ball of molten rock. If alive at the time, who could have guessed, who would have been crazy enough to have imagined that through a series of steps, that ball of molten rock would end up producing 9 million species of living organisms. Organisms so complex, so subtle, that no laboratory could come close to constructing even the simplest among them, say constructing a bacterium from scratch. And who could have guessed, who would have been crazy enough to have imagined that that ball of molten rock would end up producing us? Us with our language, our arts, our science, and our technology. So let us take a moment of silence to be astonished and grateful for the beauty of the diversity of life on Earth and our improbable existence. We now will have hymn 21 for the beauty of the earth. Well, we've decided to not require masks, but singing is still something we haven't decided yet on whether we could do. Hopefully that will happen soon. I would like to introduce our speaker now. I have noted in the opening words that Unitarian Universalism promotes the notion that wisdom can be found in many sources, in the sciences, in the arts, and the humanities. This morning, we are fortunate to have a speaker, Reverend Alison Wohler, whose career spans all of these areas. She studied biology as an undergraduate, worked in a laboratory, opened and ran an art gallery, got a master's degree in divinity, became a minister, and served the Unitarian Universalist Society of Amherst, Massachusetts for many years before retiring several years ago. We can see that Reverend Wohler has the kind of background that gives the broad perspective that supports the topic of her sermon, a sermon that spans science and philosophy. So I am very happy she accepted my invitation to speak. Reverend Wohler.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction and for helping with the service, Alan. And I just want to say I really loved your meditation before the moment of silence. It was quite beautiful. My reading this morning is from a book called Natural Religions, Reconnecting to the Real World by Neil Ferris, who's a Unitarian Universalist minister, possibly retired also. I'm going to read you a few selected paragraphs from the beginning of the book. Chapter 1 is called The Myth. It starts with, an anti-nature attitude lies at the root of the creation by severing story in Genesis. Much has been said about the sense of alienation or estrangement that underlies the need for religion and psychotherapy in our society, without mention of the critical role played by the beginning verses of the Bible, the Judeo-Christian Muslim myth of creation. When God set out to create heaven and earth, he found nothing around him but chaos, desolation, emptiness, and void. The face of the deep over which his spirit hovered was clothed in darkness. After speaking light into existence, he made a firmament to divide the upper waters from the lower waters. The earth emerged from the lower waters that became the sea. This myth, this separation is not an act of creation. It is an act of violence that results in the destruction of a previously existing creation and the formation of a new ordering of existence. The biblical myth summarizes the Hebrew suppression of goddess worship that had lasted many thousands of years before the conquest of Palestine. Feminine scholars and theologians show how the Bible may be read in large part as a documentation of the suppression of the much older goddess worship by a male-dominated religious culture. In the midst of other traditions, any sense of separation from the divine foundation of our nature is usually explained by a misunderstanding or some fatal coincidence or simple curiosity. Whatever the cause, the human mind then perceives the world in the light, I should say the darkness of this estrangement, a condition of separateness, and therefore aloneness. We then misperceive the world because of our fundamental confusion. That sense of alienation has caused people to armor themselves against the world and even to armor themselves against their own nature and pay a heavy price for doing so. This severing, this rejection of the ancient understanding of creation as an organic process of conception and birth, and its replacement with a hierarchical reordering by the words issued from the God's brain, is supported by the primary myth of the Bible, the holy book of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim religion. Everything that follows this first biblical story rests on that mentality. The biblical myth tells us about the wound. It illustrates a world characterized by a fundamental split, both within the human mind and between humanity and nature. The wellspring of the feeling for life, the felt connection with nature, and the integrity of the human mind itself has been severed, so that, as the second Hebrew myth shows us, instead of living at peace in the Garden of Eden, the man and woman are led to disobey and, as a consequence, be thrust into a state of estrangement, at war with their own nature, mind against body, spirit against flesh, man against woman, and both against nature. This double myth that permeates our culture tells of a human soul that has been cut off from its true grounding, no longer part of a much larger nature. Under these circumstances, it should come as no surprise to read that we were commanded by a jealous, very hard to please warrior God to subdue and dominate nature. No wonder then that from this Hebrew context, there would eventually rise another religion, Christianity, that focused even more on the sense of separation and estrangement, to the point of declaring that only a supernatural act of God could save us from ourselves. The feeling of alienation that lies at the heart of male-dominated cultures forms the base of patriarchy and the perverse view of nature as something foreign or inferior to us. The second chapter begins It's called perversion. Begins with the invention of original sin, ruled out a positive attitude toward nature, including our own. The last paragraph of that chapter is, there is no good reason to think that we were born bad in either the religious or psychological sense. Having a positive view of human nature, even in the face of the ills of the world, is an important part of healing what ails us. I spent my third year in theological school as a full-time intern at the Unitarian Universalist Church in Concord, Massachusetts. Concord is the home of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, and Walden Pond is just a few miles away. It's a great pond for kayaking if you ever get up there. Concord is ground zero for transcendentalists, from whom we get a taste of naturalism. Emerson said, "The first in time and the first in importance of the influences upon the mind is that of nature." Emerson and the Concord transcendentalists were, however, mostly using nature as a means to find God within themselves. Many of us who now identify as naturalists would tend not to find the supernatural as important as did Emerson. And I'll talk more about this later. Being the determinist that I am, that everything now is a product of everything that came before, I find many reasons why I might now be a hard and fast naturalist. I grew up next to a ravine and learned a lot playing in the woods. A love of nature was instilled in me by my dad. I don't know how many kinds of mushrooms and funguses he pointed out growing on trees. My undergraduate degree was in biology, particularly environmental science and the ecological truths of our interconnected world, our universe, in fact. The physical, chemical, and mathematical and social science disciplines all played into one complicated world. On top of that, I'm a lifelong Unitarian Universalist, steeped in our seventh principle of the web of life and our desire to use the discoveries of science informing our understandings. Where did we come from? What does it mean to be human? How are we to be with each other? These questions lead us on our long and complicated spiritual journeys, not complete even yet. And then just recently, another connection to the naturalistic philosophy popped up. I've been playing around with my family tree on ancestry.com, and if all the connections are correct, it seems that about 7 or 8 generations back on my father's side, I am related to the 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume. Hume was known especially for his philosophical empiricism and skepticism. His naturalism lay in his belief that philosophical justification could be rooted only in the regularities of the natural world. Sometimes considered the founder of naturalism, Hume strove to create a naturalistic science of man that explained the psychological basis of human nature. He was not a traditionally religious person, yet he dealt with some of our biggest religious questions. What does it mean to be human? How are we connected to the world? I don't consider myself to be traditionally religious either. And I expect many of you, my fellow Unitarian Universalists, do not consider yourselves to be very traditionally religious. Somehow, given all the factors of my background and perhaps some wild and persistent sticky genetic material from David Hume, I arrived at a point in my spiritual life where a sense of connection and interdependence between and among everything that is and everything that happens has become the cornerstone of my religious understanding, my faith. It's also why I'm so prone to saying, in response to almost any question for which we might prefer a definite answer, it's more complicated than that. When everything is connected to everything else, it's difficult to separate out explanations or answers that are truly independent. It's always more complicated. In this sermon, as usual in my sermons, I'm following the advice of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who said on the role of the minister, the true preacher can be known by this, that he deals out to the people his life passed through the fire of thought. This is what I'm doing for you today. My life passed through the fire of thought in the hopes that something of my experience will touch something in you. Religious naturalism is the term I use to describe my own theological views, but I would answer to the description mystic naturalist also. What is the difference between these two modifiers, mystic and religious? Pantheist is another word for me, but only in my own particular definition of pantheism. Pantheist, non-theist is probably more applicable, but just as in the pairing of mystic and naturalism, the two words can appear in their common usage to be at odds. I also identify with some aspects of religious humanism, but usually prefer to not call myself a humanist. Let me try and sort out some of these theological positions for you. The word theology itself can be a sticking point for some. Literally, it means the study of God or God talk. But for many in the liberal religious traditions, the word theology can also mean the study of our ground of being or the study of what you find most important of ultimacy. It's the study of those ever-present questions we humans face. The word religious can also be a hot button, but I think of it in terms of its original or literal meaning, to rebind or reconnect. This is what we humans are trying to do, reconnect with something our human minds have separated us from, the oneness of the world. Let's talk about the term naturalism. To a naturalist, all that is necessary to understand the universe and our human lives is available in the natural world, as opposed to the supernatural world. A naturalist, by most people's definition, is a non-theist. Again, here's another distinction I make between the words atheist and non-theist. Atheism to me is more about denying the existence of a God, or God with a capital G. Atheism against God. Non-theism, on the other hand, is simply a religious position in which a God, or God with a capital G, simply plays no part. One seems more militant than the other to my mind, so I use non-theist. John Dewey, an early naturalist, wrote, "Values prized in many religions have ideal elements that are idealizations of things characteristic of natural association, which have then been projected into a supernatural realm for safekeeping and sanction. This was the beginning of a kind of dualism and a separation of ourselves from nature that I believe has been damaging to our psyches as well as to our earth." It's the message of my earlier reading. I want to be clear, though, and repeat an important distinction. Just because a naturalist is a non-theist does not mean that person cannot be religious. I consider myself to be a pretty religious person. In the little book of Atheist Spirituality, the author writes, "People can do without organized religion, but they cannot do without communion, fidelity, and love. nor can they do without spirituality. Being an atheist by no means implies that I should castrate my soul. Here's some helpful quotes I found from the website of religiousnaturalism.org. Excuse me. A religious naturalist adopts as his or her core narrative an understanding of nature as made manifest by scientific inquiry and develops integrated religious responses, interpretive, spiritual, and moral ethical to that narrative. Some common features of the worldviews of various religious naturalists include respect for science, religious emotions, morality, concern about the ecosystem, denunciation of racism, sexism, tribalism, responsibility to the future, and intellectual appreciation of the deep consistency between and among the various disciplines of the science and the humanities, and a regard for divergent viewpoints. Sounds a lot like what we promote as Unitarian Universalists, doesn't it? Loyal Rue, author of Nature is Enough, Religious Naturalism and the Meaning of Life, says succinctly, a religious naturalist takes nature to heart. I like this because it reinforces my feeling that what we need is to take religion out of the clouds of abstraction and bring it down to earth, wherein lie our human hearts, the greening of theology. Here's another quote from the Religious Naturalist website. Religious naturalists believe that the beauty, wonder, and scientific understandings of nature are essential foundations for our pursuit of personal wholeness, social coherence, and planetary sustainability. What makes a religious naturalist religious? Our attitudes make us religious. Being religious is not about rituals and churches, but about how we feel and address our philosophy of life. Why use the word religious at all when it makes so many people uncomfortable? The Latin root of ligare, as in ligament, means to bind together. And thus religion is a fine word to describe the holding together of the components that make up a personal philosophy and a way of life. What about the use of the word God? Many religious naturalists tend to think that anything said with God language could easier be said in more ordinary language. Indeed, many religious naturalists prefer using ordinary language whenever possible, because we want to communicate in ways that are accessible to all persons. If a religious naturalist does use the word God, they mean it to be understood as a metaphor, perhaps as a synonym for mystery, for creation, for love, or for some other psychological dynamics. I found one contemporary religious naturalist whose writing perfectly reflects my own feelings and beliefs. In an article for the Journal of Liberal Religion, Roger Gillette writes, findings of modern, mostly 20th century science indicate that what we call nature is a unitary universe of matter energy in space-time, which has emerged and evolved over a period of about 13.7 billion years into a complex of perhaps 100 billion galaxies, at least one of which contains perhaps 100 billion stars, some of which are surrounded by planets, including one of which supports an emerging and evolving complex of life forms, including a species we call human. The life process involves taking in food, discharging waste, while avoiding being taken in as food, all of which require what can be called decision-making. This decision-making gradually evolved into a specialized activity we call information processing or thinking. Religious naturalism takes the findings of modern science seriously, and thus it is inherently naturalistic. But it also takes the human needs that led to the emergence of religious systems seriously, and thus is also religious. It is religious or reconnective in that it seeks and facilitates human reconnection with oneself, family, larger human community, local and global ecosystem, and unitary universe. If religious naturalism is where science and spirituality meet, as the Religious Naturalism website states, then mystic naturalism is where science and our UU7 principle meet, in my mind. I sometimes call myself a mystic naturalist because while I hold the natural world to be all there is, I understand that the natural world to be, as Roger Gillette describes, all one thing, one energy that expresses itself in many forms and many relationships. The classic mystical experience is one in which a person finds him or herself by meditative means, or often not, having a visceral feeling of oneness or connection with everything. In some religious traditions, this is described in terms of oneness with God. Sigmund Freud, who for the most part I like to ignore, but in this case he actually said something I like, called this sense of indissoluble union with the great all, he called it the oceanic feeling. I like the inference to water. For me, the mystic understanding is of a profound connection with the one energy of which all the natural world is composed. You can see perhaps why it seems we are all talking about the same thing, just in different languages. I can't say I've ever had a classic mystical experience. I guess the closest I can come is this intense faith I had that I'm somehow both held in this infinite web and known by this infinite web. If everything is connected, then I must be connected too, not just standing here outside and looking in. What I do makes a difference to that web. Therefore, I am known. I used to wear a necklace with an ancient Jewish symbol called a Hamza, which stands for the number 5, which symbolizes 5 fingers of the hand of God. With a small gem set into the hand, it becomes both the hand and eye of God. I am held in the hand and known by the eye, even though I use totally different language to say the same thing. Why do I prefer the description naturalist over humanist? Because classic humanism concentrated too much on us, to me, and not on the interdependent web. It placed too much importance and value on human beings. We may be the high-functioning thinking animal, but we are still just part of the web in the natural world. I could say that I think humanism gives us a delusionary significance, but the original humanists probably appeared that way out of their negative reaction to the importance placed on God, the non-human, in traditional monotheistic religions. A pantheist is one who believes that all is God. Pan, all, theist, God. Seeing as how I believe that everything is one creative and relational energy, but not God, I feel comfortable describing myself as a pantheist, non-theist. Richard Dawkins has written, pantheists, atheists don't believe in a supernatural God at all, but use the theist part of pantheist as a non-supernatural synonym for nature or for the universe, or for the lawfulness that governs its workings. Carl Sagan said, a religion old or new that stressed the magnificence of the universe as revealed by modern science might be able to draw forth reserves of reverence and awe hardly tapped by the conventional faiths. Sooner or later, he wrote, such a religion will emerge. I believe that our Unitarian Universalist seventh principle about our respect for the interdependent web of all existence, which could also be described as my own creative and relational energy, is leading us in that direction. The UUA published not so long ago a number of new religious education materials on their web, both for the young and for the adults. I found this story in a course called Spirit in Practice. This one is for grown-ups. It's called The Mystic and the Scientist. One day, a religious man approached a mystic and asked, "Does God exist?" "Allow me to go within for an answer," the mystic replied. After meditating for quite some time, expanding her heart consciousness to embrace the totality of existence, she answered, "I do not know what you mean by the word God, but I do know that this world is more mysterious and more wonderful than I could ever imagine. I know that you and I are part of something so much larger than our own lives. Perhaps this something larger is what you seek." Then the religious man approached the scientist. "Does God exist?" he asked. "Let me think," the scientist replied. And so she thought. She thought about the vastness of the universe, 156 billion light years, or something like 936 billion trillion miles in diameter, and the almost immeasurable smallness of a quark. She thought of how the energy of the Big Bang fuels the beating of her own heart. And then she answered, "I do not know what you mean by the word God, but I do know that this world is more mysterious and more wonderful than I could ever imagine. I know that you and I are part of something so much larger than our own lives. Perhaps this something larger is what you seek." The religious man then thought to himself. He thought of what he knows and what he does not know. He thought about how he knows what he knows and how he knows he doesn't know what he doesn't know. He thought about his experience of the world and how it is but one tiny, infinitesimal fraction of all experience. He thought about his dependence on forces larger than himself. And he thought about the interdependence of all existence. He experienced wonder and pondered mystery. And then he knew in his soul the truth of what the mystic and the scientist said, that he is part of something so much larger than his own life. And then, and only then, did he think about what to call it. Why did I mention Ralph Waldo Emerson at the beginning of this sermon? Emerson and the Transcendentalists are probably more relevant now than they were in their time, said the Reverend Susan Meyer, another Unitarian Universalist minister. They speak out of our UU tradition to a postmodern mindset that is tired of scientism and reductionism, just as they were reacting against the Enlightenment rationalism of their day. They offered us a naturalistic spirituality, a naturalist mysticism without metaphysics or supernaturalism. I always knew I liked Emerson. I think he and I have a lot in common, although he's more famous. There's so much potential within the roots and wings of Unitarian Universalism to engage people with a different kind of religious thinking and take our hurting human hearts and this hurting world on by storm. My path to that healing is through religious, mystic, pantheistic naturalism. My closing words are these. The most ancient words I found on our subject are from Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, who said, "All things are part of one single system, which is called nature." That was 2,300 years ago. And then came the religions of the Bible that took us far away from that philosophy. Finally, we are experiencing a comeback of what seems so obvious. All things are part of one single system, which is called nature. May you have heard something of yourselves in the part of me I have brought to you this morning. Blessed be, and thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Wohler. I particularly enjoyed that last story where the mystic and the religious person and the scientist all came together in that one notion. Okay, I'm going to extinguish the chalice now. Mary's going to extinguish the chalice with words from the philosopher Marcus Aurelius, who was also a Stoic, as Zeno was. He says, everything harmonizes with me, which harmonizes with thee, O universe. Nothing for me is too early or too late. That's in due time for thee. Everything is fruit to me that thy season brings, O nature. From thee all things, in thee all things, to thee all things return. We will now have joys and concerns. Does anybody have a joy or concern